Welcome to the Republican Professor. This morning we have Dr. Sanjay Merchant joining us from Illinois, Chicago, right?
That's right.
Do you live in the city of Chicago?
I live in the west suburbs.
Okay. What's that mean? What's it called? Is that where
The town I live in is called Roselle. West suburbs are like any suburbs in America, I suppose, but tangentially related to the city, and I go downtown to the city for school every day.
Cool. I'm in frozen California, freezing my butt off. Oh my gosh. It's freezing out there. I had to put a sweater on today.
I didn't know cold until I came to Chicago. It's
really,
it's a different level here. Yeah.
Now, Sanjay, you grew up in Southern California, right?
That's right. I did.
You went to UCLA, as I recall, because you hated USC. I think I specifically remember you saying that. I hate USC. And it's even on your resume.
That's right. Yeah. No, just flip that around. Just flip that around, and then you got it right.
Oh, I flip it around. Okay. Sorry. Sanjay, what did you major in college?
Computer engineering.
Okay. So you grew up in what part of Orange County? Or what part of Southern California?
Mission Viejo, South Orange County. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. You went to SC, studied computer engineering, and this would have been in the 90s. Is that right?
Yep. Mid-90s. So, yep.
So that was like right when computers started getting even more interesting than they had ever been before.
Yep. My sophomore year is the first time I ever heard of the internet. My calculus professor asked me, "Have you ever heard of the World Wide Web?" I remember him asking me that after class. And I said, no. And I was a computer engineering major.
What was your response? Well, hold on. Why did you want to do computer engineering if you didn't even know, like, what were you thinking? Like, you wanted to design Atari games or what?
Right. I mean, back in those days, 80s, people were starting to get personal computers in their homes and didn't know what to do with them exactly, but they wanted to have them. And then towards the 90s, we didn't have internet, but we were, popping in floppy disks of games and things and doing some word processing and printing from home. So, and that was back in the days when people would say, "Oh, computers are the wave of the future." People would say that all the time, like they were paid to say that. I heard that all the time. That's the wave of the future. So, I was a young, ambitious, intelligent kid, and I said, "Well, I'm gonna study computers," and everybody applauded me for that. So that's why I did it.
Okay. Did you have pressure from your family to study that, or did they say study whatever you want?
I wouldn't say pressure, but study whatever you want really wasn't an option either. My father is from India, and
what part of Indiana? Indianapolis, South Bend,
Mumbai, Indiana.
Bombay. I've never heard of that part.
Yeah. So,
is that where Mike Pence was? I know he was the governor of Indiana.
He might have been there. You have to go as far east as you can.
Wow. So your dad was from a major city. It's a huge city there.
Yeah.
In India. And when did he come to US?
He was a chemical engineer. And
I don't think I ever knew that.
Yeah, for a lot of Indians, I don't know if I'm stereotyping here or doing something inappropriate. I have no idea, but I don't
even know what a stereotype is, to be honest with you.
That's true. That's a good point. I've never entirely understood the meaning of that term, but in any case,
isn't it just like people talking about their experience?
Could be. It
could
like
be. how they experienced or stuff. It's like stereotypically cars have, 4 wheels and
right.
You're just saying what a car is.
Yeah, when you generalize about a group of people, people can get a little bit nervous or touchy about it. But I think this is true, and I don't think there's anything offensive in it. It's been my experience is that in the 20th century, maybe things have changed, but Indian immigrants to the West came here for a couple things. There's sort of a cliche: medical school or engineering. You didn't come here to study philosophy, right? I mean, that was thought to be pretty silly. And my dad definitely had that attitude. So he would talk about things like pre-law, pre-med, engineering. If I ever mentioned anything else, which I don't remember ever doing, but he would laugh it off. I remember him sort of mocking philosophy, talking about his college days. He had a friend that studied philosophy and he thought it was absurd and that sort of thing. And I never knew any cousins or uncles who came and studied in the US or anything like that did anything other than engineering. So I would say I came from an engineering family. So that was kind of the expectation.
Okay. Where did your dad go to college?
He went to a small school in, you're not going to believe this, in Indiana, called, it was in Fort Wayne. And it was, shoot, I'm sure somebody knows. I think Indiana Tech, I believe. But that was for grad school. He did college in Bombay.
Was the language that he studied in English in Bombay?
I believe so. I mean, it is the national language of India, so all the youth. Yeah, I believe it was in English. Yeah.
Okay. So he had a pretty high level of English coming over here then?
Oh, for sure. Everybody does. Indian. I mean, as I said, English is the national language of India. So people that don't speak English in India is pretty rare, actually.
I don't know much about India, to be honest with you. To be dishonest with you, I know a lot. I want to make sure I cover both the honest and the dishonest.
Yeah.
That's what I say when people say honestly, and I'll say, well, but cover the other side too. Say dishonestly.
Right.
Don't be biased toward the truth. We don't need bias in our culture. Well, okay, so you're at SC. You grew up a Mission VA Joe. I think you mispronounced it. There's a J in there. I checked.
I do that sometimes.
Well, wait, how do you say Trader Hose?
Trader Jose.
I'm not sure if I'm saying that one right either.
Trader Jose, yeah, you got it right.
Well, okay, so you're like, if people don't know what Mission Viejo is, it's like, what's a very nice part of Orange County. It's like, it's not the slums. It's right. Did you guys have a swimming pool?
We didn't. No, barely had a backyard.
I know which house it is then. I know exactly where, because there's only one house that doesn't have a swimming pool there.
That's right.
So you went to SC. You were majoring in computer science. And you somehow made a switch to philosophy. Was that happening in college or what? Because I remember, I guess I didn't say my warm anecdote. I probably should say my warm anecdote. I met Sanjay as a graduate student in the philosophy program at Biola. And this would have been early 2000s. And Sanjay worked full-time at that time. He worked at a financial services firm, and he drove a fair distance from LA County, from southwest LA County to southeast LA County. And LA County is not a joke as far as traffic goes. You took the 91 probably from Torrance. I guess you weren't coming from home. Maybe you were coming from home. I don't know. But I think you worked in Brea or something.
Yeah, exactly.
And then did you just stay there and then come over to Biola? Or did you go home and then come back to Biola?
Yeah, it varied. But many days I did that. But you're right. Going back and forth on the 91 was a time-consuming part of my life.
Yeah, not fun.
Yeah. No,
not fun. Yeah, the 91 goes through like Compton and the lower part of Compton and through south of Watts. It's not LA City. That would be 105, which is parallel, and into Torrance, which I believe is where you were living at the time. You had a family. Yes. You were one of those guys that had a family. You were married. You had kids. I think they were young at the time.
Yep.
I can't remember how many you had at that time. But you had a lot going on, and I just remember you being extremely dedicated. You were a true believer, is what I would say you were. You were one of those that does it as a true believer. You were there because you had a fire burning in your bosom, and you had an insatiable curiosity, and you were going to learn this stuff, damn it. And so that's how I remember you. And so now, okay, you're at SC. You were saying how you got into philosophy.
Yeah, well, I didn't get into philosophy per se. I became a Christian my freshman year, which was really troubling to my parents because it was a pretty radical conversion. I was raised in a very secular home. My father was a nominal Hindu, as many more. He came from a very wealthy home, more affluent Indians, I think, kind of practice a kind of secular kind of Hinduism, and came to the U.S. and married an American woman. So, his Hinduism was not really central to his life, but it was part of who he was to some degree. My mother was nominal Catholic, and so we had a very secular home. These questions just didn't really come up, and so I was a sort of standard American secular teen when I went to college, which is to say, I had something of a negative attitude towards Christianity. Struck me as more than just odd, something that other people did, but I didn't understand their motivations. I didn't understand the claim. I heard Jesus saves, and no context for what that means. And when I hear it explained by my peers, I took offense to it. It sounded silly to me. It was poorly expressed. It was sometimes seemed to me to be contradictory. Not that my thinking about big questions was very well formed either. So I became a Christian in my freshman year.
Well,
there's a big story there.
Yeah. Okay.
I guess there's a lot to say about it. But I did.
Did you go to one of those camps where you spoke in tongues, or
almost,
what happened?
Almost, not too far off. Yeah, so I had some friends from high school who were pretty persistent. One thing I did respect about them is they were my close friends, and they themselves had become believers later in high school. And so that put a little bit of a wedge in our relationship, but they were pretty persistent and would allow me to ask them questions. And we got beyond kind of tit for tat kind of debating into some more serious conversations, which was very good, and which I respected. And I was by no means converted or even thinking of doing such a thing, but at least I respected the fact that they were taking it seriously as I would want to take it. And in college, I ended up meeting some very passionate believers. And between my old high school friends and these new people that I met in college, I was exposed to some clearer and more attractive thoughts about the Christian faith that I hadn't considered, things that I hadn't known. And one night I ended up, on the encouragement of a friend, reading the Gospel of John. And that night I was just totally undone reading the Gospel of John. I remember thinking at one moment, not quite praying, but I think saying out loud, if anyone knows God, Jesus knows God. I'm just so totally overwhelmed with the person of Jesus. And so I didn't know it at the time, but now I would express that as the work of the Holy Spirit. I didn't know that at the time. I didn't know what that experience was like. Now I know that experience pretty well, but at the time I didn't know that. And so it wasn't just my wisdom or insight in reading the Gospel of John that made me say, aha, yes. So Jesus, right? I wasn't figuring out anything. This was the illuminating work of the Spirit. And so in the morning when I woke up, as far as I know, I was a converted believer in the morning. And I had this new knowledge that I didn't have before I fell asleep, that Jesus was Lord. And I did believe it in a very untrained way from that morning forward. So
wow.
So I had a big conversion to the Christian faith, big dramatic conversion in many ways, and that was really odd to my parents. But now
Did you tell your parents right away?
Within the week I did. I kind of had to let things settle and figure out what had happened to me. And within the week I did. I actually went home, Mission Viejo, Orange County, not too far from downtown LA, as you know, and went home for the weekend. And immediately my sister knew that there was something weird. She knew. She's 6 years younger than me, so she was middle school at the time. She knew that something was up. And she called me out on it immediately. And I pulled out a Bible from my backpack, and her eyes got really big, and she started yelling, "He's got a Bible!" You know, like he's got a bomb or something. And my dad had kind of a stern conversation with me. And I was a little bit surprised by that. But both my parents were very skeptical because they saw the pretty radical change in me, and they thought it was cultic. They thought somebody had manipulated me. Within about a year time, my dad admitted to me that no, the change in me was genuine, he thought, and he was impressed by it. And he thought that it had changed me in a good way. He didn't think somebody was manipulating me. So he came just short of saying it was a legitimate conversion. And you really do know Jesus. But that was really nice to hear within a year's time. But as you can imagine, just this radical change in me.
Were you a party guy? Were you, what would you say the change was?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I wasn't a big party guy, but a little bit. I was in many ways just a normal American teen. So as a teenager, came home drunk a couple times, and you know, had it in with my parents.
Yeah.
Adversarial with my parents at times. I wouldn't say that, you know, there's really bad case scenarios that everybody, you know, knows somebody like that or has been like that themselves. It wasn't the worst case, and I wasn't a Boy Scout either. Somewhere in between. Yeah. So the conversion was not really interested in dating, more interested in going to church. My mom thought that was really weird. You know, not interested in drinking or partying, or they expected that, you know, I would do some of that stuff and get some of that out of my system, what they expected in a normal way. And I'm really going headlong in the other direction. Being more chaste, being entirely sober, you know, not pursuing girls, not pursuing those sorts of things. Always carrying around a Bible, talking about the Bible. You know, that struck them as strange, for sure, which is understandable. So yeah, it was clear to them that my commitment, most of all, was to knowing Jesus, talking about Jesus, learning the Bible. And so they didn't understand that.
So how did this translate into, how did this shape your vocational vision? What did you, at this point, were you still thinking, okay, I'm going to go get a job, a normal job, whatever normal means? I don't even know what that means, but just a W-2 job somewhere.
Yeah.
What was the timeline like, and what did that look like in terms of your shaping what you wanted to do?
Yeah, I was a computer engineering major, like I said, and I expected to be doing something in either hardware design or software development or something like that. And this was all, you know, early 90s was all sort of burgeoning stuff, and we didn't know where it would go. And so it's just so many opportunities, and I fully expected to do that. As I got more settled in a Christian life, and my friends and the people that I knew best had the same commitments, I got to, you know, be exposed to what Christian ministry was and the value of it, and thought maybe I would do that. Maybe I would pastor, because this took up all of my mental and emotional time, was being a biblical Christian, more so than being a computer engineer. And of course, there's a lot of computer engineers who are both biblical Christians and computer engineers, and they do one thing vocationally, and the other thing is, you know, it has to do with the biggest issues and matters in their lives. For me, everything was sort of sucked into, you know, becoming a biblical Christian and understanding what had happened in my conversion. So I thought, well, you could kill two birds with one stone by going into ministry and sort of bringing those two things together. And my thinking was kind of moving in that direction, but I never left computer engineering. At USC. There wasn't a good option in the religion department or something like that to study theology. That was a really bad decision to go there. So, a job with you mentioned, working at Capital Group, which was a financial company, but I worked in IT for them, doing some in-house programming and things. And at the time, or like you said, early 2000s, it occurred to me I wanted to study apologetics. I was very drawn to the intellectual expression and defense of the Christian faith, because a lot of it had been very valuable to me, because I became a believer with a very secular, unformed viewpoint. I just sort of had breathed in certain things in the air and didn't realize that I had a philosophy, I had a scientific view, I had a historical view that I just sort of breathed in. I never really thought through it. And squaring that now with my Christian faith and my affections and my dedication to Jesus, my head and my heart were sometimes in two different places. And I didn't want to feel schizophrenic. So I found that reading a couple books in apologetics helped me bring, say, history and my faith together. If I'm reading something about the historicity of the resurrection, it helps me form my historical view, understand history, and bring it together with my faith. Or something about, say, the fine-tuning argument for God, something in philosophy, helps me bring my scientific understanding of the world and my faith together. So apologetics was doing that. So I thought, why don't I study apologetics? So now the internet existed. This is the late 90s, and I got online and I searched for master's programs in apologetics. And as far as I could find, there was one in the world at the time. And this would have been like 99, maybe 2000. There was one in the world, and it was at Biola University. And I thought, oh my gosh, Biola University is only about 7 miles from where I'm working right now in Brea. I wondered, could I continue working here and maybe take some classes? What are the class times? Could I pop by there for a class or something and maybe do a degree in apologetics? And so that's kind of how I got into making that transition over.
Okay, yeah. So Brea, if you don't know Orange County, how it relates to Southeast or LA County and La Mirada, where Biola is. Brea is about 6 miles away or something, maybe.
Is it?
Down Imperial Highway, it's like 15-minute drive, something like that. So that would have been convenient for you. How did the classes work out for you as far as popping over after work?
I was hoping it would somehow miraculously work out perfectly.
Yeah.
And at the time, it's not like it is now.
Right.
With a lot of flexibility. There was far less, far less flexibility at the time. So I was able to find an evening class or two, but it was, the commitment would have been a sort of daytime on campus classwork kind of commitment. So I ended up, working it out that with my boss that I could use some vacation days, and I would use those hours midday, and he would consider it a longer lunch, but it would count as vacation time. And so I more or less had my hair on fire in those years, where I would just work it out from semester to semester, try to make it work. And by God's grace, it worked. But yeah, my hair was on fire, and my poor wife was at home more than she needed to be or wanted to be, with some very young kids. So it was very hectic times for our family.
How young were your kids at that time?
Early 2000s, I had my oldest two.
What are their names? Do you want to say?
So Serena, she was born in 2000, right before I started the program. She just graduated from USC.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, dude.
Yep. Yeah. Just a few months.
Oh, wow.
Yep. So that was just a few months ago.
I feel like I just aged 40 years.
Oh yeah. Feel it. Which is surprising for a professor to say, because, you've been in the classroom for quite some time like me. And, every year we get kids just as young as they've always been. And we realize that we're moving. But our students,
I think that's why it's so weird sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, my oldest, she just graduated from college. My second oldest, Nathaniel, he's a Division I lacrosse player. Really proud of him, living his dream, playing lacrosse on the East Coast right now. And then I've got two younger ones that were born a little bit later in the 2000s, Zeke and Grace, and they're with us at home still. So, but the time I knew you, when I first met you, would have been the early 2000s. So we had the two at home.
So, how many degrees did you do at Biola?
I moved over from apologetics when I realized that the apologetics degree I really enjoyed. I really enjoyed studying it, and I thought, what can you do with it? And it's really a ministry-based degree, and I thought, this is awesome. Maybe I could actually, instead of just consuming apologetics and then turning around into ministry, maybe I could actually produce apologetics. I don't know. And so I was unfamiliar with Christian philosophy, totally unfamiliar with it. Really didn't know that it was.
At the time, you didn't realize that it's really philosophy that's driving most of the apologetics.
Yeah, really had no idea.
It's a standard discipline, and you can major in it at any college, pretty much, almost.
That's right.
Including USC.
Yeah, my little Christian community at USC, we thought of very fideistic, that is kind of faithy and preachy in our understanding of the Christian faith, as opposed to rigorously philosophical.
And you never took a class with Dallas Willard, right?
Never did. Went to some lectures.
Does that pain you as you look back on it?
I think so. In hindsight, it would have been a great opportunity. I went to some lectures that he gave, but I wasn't ready to study philosophy. At Biola, I realized philosophy. Yeah, I realized it was a real discipline. It wasn't just a secular discipline. It could be done in fidelity to the Christian faith. So people like J.P. Moreland, were there, Scott Ray. And,
you said infidelity, two not infidelity.
Yeah.
Okay.
I should have said yes. Yeah. So yeah, these guys gave a great model of how to bring those things together. And they were
a lot of them were Dallas Willard grads right out of USC. That's the funny thing about your story.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so
you said fideistic. So for people who don't know what that word means, what would you say it means? You said that your USC time, your group was fideistic. There's probably somebody out here that's wondering what that means. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, for sure.
So it's not a compliment.
Well, for some people it is, and they are about fideism. They say I ascribe to fideism, and from my perspective, no, I don't use it in a complimentary way, because I do think it's a wrong understanding of how Christian thought should operate. But here's the idea. Here's one way to think of it. The Christian faith, of course, rooted in the Bible, has certain scientific, historical, and let's say ethical entailments. So, first verse of the Bible: in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That has certain scientific entailments. For example, one thing that we might imagine then is that I guess the universe began to exist. I guess the universe isn't eternal, as the vast majority of Christian theologians and Bible interpreters have always understood that, despite the fact that some of the best ancient thinkers thought that the universe was eternal. For example, Aristotle insisted that the universe was eternal, and insofar as Aristotelian science was influential, it was hard to square those two things. So one way you can go is you can just say Aristotle beat it. And I believe the word. And well, how do you respond to Aristotle? I don't. I have nothing to say to him. Does he have anything that's insightful, that's helpful to us? I don't care. The fideistic attitude would say something like that. So it separates Christian commitment from philosophy, science, and history, and keeps them in entirely separate categories. And that can lead to all sorts of harmful consequences.
I grew up in a church like that.
Yeah.
That was the church I grew up in, fideistic.
Yeah, it's very common because
Anti-intellectual, right? Wouldn't you say it's anti-intellectual?
that would be one way to characterize it, as anti-intellectual. Absolutely. There are some brilliant Fiedeists. It doesn't mean stupid. By no means does it mean stupid. So Karl Barth, probably the most well-known 20th century Protestant theologian, could be accused of having a Fideistic view, but the guy was brilliant. They just want to keep them separate. And there's all sorts of bad consequences. And I think the reason is because I tell my students this: you can't help being a philosopher, scientist, and historian.
Yeah.
You're a philosopher by birth because you have rational thoughts.
That's right.
You get here today in class, dressed nicely, ready to learn, ready to think.
People dress nicely for your classes? Wait, where do you teach?
Yeah, they dress very nicely, appropriately enough. It works for me. And
cool. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Well, they're there ready to think about their thoughts, to do some philosophy, to do some second order thinking. So I said, even though you're not a professional philosopher with a Ph.D., you're a philosopher by birth. You're a scientist by birth. You have sense organs. You can see things, touch things, taste things, smell things, and make form knowledge based on your sense experiences. That's what science is rooted in. And then you're a historian by birth because you have a memory, you remember things, and you have a sort of construction of the past. So you can be a bad philosopher, scientist, and historian, but you can't be a non-philosopher, scientist, and historian. You're going to have a philosophical, scientific, and historical view of the world. If you're going to be a Christian at the same time, then we've got to bring together the words of prophets and apostles, inspired by and illuminated by the work of the Holy Spirit in our lives, with our philosophical, scientific, and historical understandings, and bring them together. That's what discipleship is about in large measure, to bring the heart and the head together. Fideism sort of keeps them separate.
Yep.
And I think keeps us in the schizophrenic state, which I think is very unfortunate in a lot of people's lives.
So you're taking, so you realize, at what point did you realize Christian apologetics? There's a lot of philosophy here, and that's a thing. And Biola has a degree in that, and what do you know? I can just sign up for those classes.
Right.
When was that happening?
Oh, so yeah, so I got to Biola, started in apologetics, switched over to philosophy, and when I realized the value of it, did the degree in philosophy, graduated around 2006. I looked at some grad schools in philosophy, and really I realized at the time, and my wife and I were talking about it, that I really had a sense that God was calling me to philosophical theology because of my love for the Bible, my love for the doctrines of the Christian faith, and to express the Christian faith in a philosophically astute way, but not necessarily to be a philosopher. As you knew at the time, we had these real superstar friends and classmates who went to some of the best schools of philosophy for PhD. I didn't see myself personally in that same vein. So I stayed at Biola, Talbot, and I studied theology as well. So I got an MA theology to sort of bring those things together a little bit better, which was really valuable to me. And then I was about to graduate for the second time in 2008. And someone in the registrar's office said to me, you've got so many units here. If you take one more class, literally you need one unit, you can have the degree in apologetics too. So I said, okay. So 2008, I did philosophy and apologetics. And so with all of that, I've got now philosophy, theology, and apologetics. I felt pretty well-rounded. And then I went on to Claremont and transitioned to finally, with 4 kids at this point, quitting my career. My wife was very supportive, went over to Claremont, still stayed in Southern California because of the family. We just had another baby. I was considering going to Aberdeen in Scotland, and was talking to the faculty there, and we realized that's not going to happen.
That would have been a major move.
Major.
Wow.
But as you could tell, my head was in the clouds at that time, and my wife bringing me down to earth. So I went to Claremont, and it was a great time.
Were you vested at Capital Group yet?
I was.
Okay, that probably helps.
that helped a ton. That helped a ton to get through all of that.
Vested basically means your 401k has tenure.
That's right. That's right.
So that takes like 6 years or something.
Mhm.
So okay, now you have 3 degrees from Biola now, and you're looking at Claremont, and you're thinking, oh, I can do a PhD there and have it match up with my interests in philosophical theology.
Yeah. So again, I got on the internet and I was looking for PhDs in philosophical theology or philosophy of religion. And it turned out that I could find 2. One was at Oxford, and one was at Claremont. I was, as I mentioned, I was looking at Aberdeen and a couple other schools in Scotland because I was kind of dabbling with systematic theology, and Aberdeen was a great place for systematic theology at the time. So
who was there at Claremont that you could study with?
So at Claremont, they explicitly had a degree. It was called Philosophy of Religion and Theology. There was no other degree like that. And it was known as a very theologically liberal place, very different than Biola. Theologically liberal, one way to define it, as opposed to not necessarily conservative, but maybe the alternative would be biblical Christianity as opposed to liberal Christianity. Biola Talbot's a very biblically Christian place. That is to say, that's the MO of evangelicals, is to say,
yes,
that's interesting. Where is that in the Bible? Right? If I make some philosophical claim, evangelicals will say, okay, is that biblical? That's kind of the evangelical MO.
Mm-hmm.
So biblical Christianity, most Christians would think, is there another kind? Well,
right.
So it seems like it's almost redundant to say, but there is another kind. Is it a Christianity or not? Okay, we can talk about that.
Right.
But you've got biblical Christianity where we want to root our beliefs in Scripture in some valid way. Liberal Christianity is not necessarily motivated by that. One way to define biblical Christianity, it would be continuing on the general outline of the Christian faith, or perhaps carrying on the sort of central doctrines of the Christian faith without rooting them in the Bible per se. They want to root them in something else, something maybe more relevant to our times. So in the 19th and 20th century, we saw that happening a lot. Whether there even is liberal Christianity anymore, liberal doesn't mean I voted for Biden. It's not politically liberal, although sometimes those things do go together. But it means liberal in the sense that I'm open to more sources for theology than just the Bible, or they might say the Bible was an older source for Christian theology. Now we have a newer one. So, of course, I went to Claremont with a good bit of skepticism, but knowing that there were people there, although they didn't come to the conclusions that I might want to, that thought deeply about bringing theology and philosophy together. And insofar as they trained themselves and trained others to do that work, I just wanted to learn how to do that. I didn't necessarily want to come to their wacky conclusions.
Right. And did they accept you?
Yeah, funny.
I don't mean admit you into the program. I mean, when you got there socially, were you accepted?
That's the funny thing. The funny experience. I was told by some Biola profs, you're going to have to keep your head down, and maybe they're going to see you as a fundamentalist, and you might not fit in very well.
So in other words, they're intolerant.
Right, right, something like that. They're not going to tolerate.
Why don't you just say that? I mean, it'd be like if you're a black person and you're like, I'm thinking about going to this Klan rally. Can you give me some feedback? They don't go, well, you want to keep your head down.
Right.
They might not accept you.
Right. I don't know if it's that bad, but the analogy is not.
Well, the good thing is you can put a hood on and if you don't, they can't see that you're black, I guess. Well, I guess they could, because they could see your hands. I don't know. I've never worn one of those costumes, so I guess they could see inside your eyes. But anyway, it's going to come out, right? At some point.
Right. And
I don't know why you'd want to go to a Klan rally, though. I guess if it was something you needed for your interest or your work, and you had to go through the Klan rally to get there, I guess. Anyway, it's not a perfect analogy, but no analogies are perfect. So
sure. So I would not personally compare the faculty and students in the religion department to Klansmen, but there's definitely
but you have to. I think what you really mean is you already have compared them, and they're different.
Okay.
I think that's what you mean.
Yeah, that's a good distinction there. It's philosophically astute. So
you have to do the comparison first to find out if they're different. That's why people say, "Do you just compare me?" And they're all offended as if merely comparing something is evil or bad. No, comparing is just called thinking.
Right.
You do it all the time, and so it's just short. That was just shorthand for I've done the comparison and they're different.
Yep. Well
anyway,
done.
okay, sorry.
Yeah. So at Claremont, the interesting thing was I feel as if in many ways I was accepted, and
that's good.
There were some people there that were intellectual liberals in the best sense.
Oh,
in the best sense, open-minded.
That's good.
Not prejudging so much.
Okay.
And that was by no means most of the time. I would say most of the time for a theological conservative, or I said biblical Christian, somebody who's sort of conserving and keeping the Christian tradition, which is rooted back into the Bible itself, having sort of that backwards looking perspective rather than a forward looking, what's the new thing kind of perspective like they had at Claremont. As you can imagine, there's some people that just consider that just so quaint and even silly. And so I did get that attitude sometimes.
That's interesting.
But I just feel like at Talbot, I got so much really good, solid, clear-minded thinking that I never felt I never felt insecure. I never felt as if I couldn't, stand up on my own 2 feet and make the case for something that the professor was trying to contradict. I had no problem doing that. Maybe I was a bit more arrogant at the time and a little bit too confident in myself, but grad school gets some of that out of you. So you become more intellectually humble, and I definitely did, but I never felt any insecurity or anything. In fact, one professor, he's the chair of process theology at Claremont. So that's a very radical liberal theology. I was actually his research assistant. We had a good relationship, although I didn't like that stuff. I didn't believe in any of it.
What's the name of the person?
His name is Roland Faber. So I had a very good relationship with him. And he was, as I was mentioning, some of the more open-minded, thoughtful, liberal in the best sense kind of people. For me, he was one of them. Very helpful to me.
Was he on your dissertation?
He ended up not being, just because because process theology and the kind of work that he did, he could have been, and I think it would have been great. I never asked him to because it just was a little bit too out of step with what he did, and I got some people that I thought were more appropriate for my committee. But
what was the most interesting class you took there?
There was a couple interesting classes. I took a class in medieval Trinitarianism, which ended up being really, I didn't know at the time, this is before I decided to do Trinity as a research project and dissertation work. Really helpful to me. I took another class with Michael Shermer. I don't know if you know his name. He's the president of the Skeptic Society and really rabid atheist, sort of public atheist.
Can you give me some evidence that he's ahead of the Skeptic Society? I just don't believe it. I
know it on the basis of testimony. People have told me that it's true, and so I just accept it.
Testimony is good evidence, then?
I don't think so. I think you have to see it for yourself.
How can I know that testimony is good evidence, though? I mean, I've heard it. I've heard that.
Right.
Anyway, okay, sorry.
Yeah, Lucas,
sorry for this dorky jokes here.
You need evidence for your evidence all the way down. An infinite stream of evidence is all you need, and then you know it. So
I'll take your word for it.
Thank you. I took a class with him on evolution and economics. Very strange combination, evolution and economics. I learned nothing about economics in that class, but we read some books on Darwinism, and man, I was a pain in that class. I was always sort of trying to take a intellectual hacket to naturalism, not hacket, what do I want to say? Hatchet to naturalism, and always trying to be kind and thoughtful, but in hindsight, it was pretty combative. But my goodness, Shermer's whole understanding of these philosophical issues was so sophomoric. It was so just basic. I was just appalled. Honestly, I was just appalled that this was a graduate class, and so I'm glad for that exercise in that class. I didn't learn anything of value in it, but I did get exposed to sort of a popularizer of atheism with a Ph.D. and the sort of level of thinking that they're willing to bring to the topic. Just utterly unimpressed. And so that just emboldened me even more. Gosh, the gospel is so much deeper, so much more thoughtful. And if this is one of the best examples of what contemporary atheism can do, my gosh,
Yeah.
We're going to win easy.
It's a selective skepticism. That's the funny thing about Michael Shermer's deal is he's very selectively skeptic. Now I want to ask you a question. Is he a libertarian then on economics? Is he like a Hayek fan? Did you pick up on any of that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. As I said,
because a lot of those guys do like the evolutionary. They when you talk about top-down economic models, libertarians correctly are skeptical about whether any centralized authority has enough knowledge to plan out the economy, like, for example, Democrats want to do. And so they love the free market, which has no designer, no planner, comes together from the bottom up, and it appears to be designed, but it's not. So for example, here's an example of like getting lunch in New York City. There's no lunch commissioner. There's no bureaucrat that centralized all those decision making about lunch. No, it's a bunch of apparently random folks in the marketplace trying to meet a need and make a buck. And it looks, and what do you know? It's organized. So they look at evolution like that, and they see. So I'm always conflicted when I talk to folks like that, because I love exactly what they're saying about economics. That's true. The free market is much better at being efficient, and people get lunch a lot more efficiently because there's no bureaucrat dictating all of those decisions about which hot dog stand will serve how much relish and which fancy deli will blah 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 and what time. So anyway, I was just curious. I don't know anything about his economic views, but it wouldn't surprise me that he's a Hayek person.
Yeah, there was another professor for that class who was there a whole lot less than Shermer, and he took on the economic side, and for the life of me, I can't remember his name.
Oh, okay. Who taught your medieval Trinitarianism? Was that Min?
It was Anselm Min, just recently passed away. Yeah,
Anselm Min. What a first name.
Yeah, Korean-born, brilliant theologian.
Wow.
Jesuit, I believe, Catholic theologian who had been, when he came to Claremont, very theologically liberal. I think Hegelian, modern philosopher, trying to bring together modern philosophy and the historical Christian faith. But he, as far as I understand, I think he recanted all of that and became more of a traditional Catholic, Thomistic, that is Thomas Aquinas, medieval style theologian, which ironically jives much better with the Protestant view of things. At least it's historically set, and that sort of historical trajectory goes back to the apostles and prophets and things. So there's a much more commonality. So when I took the class with him, it was very helpful to me.
Was he on your committee?
He was.
Cool. Yeah. Now, what did you do your dissertation on?
My dissertation was broadly on Trinitarian theology, specifically on how you can tell the difference between legitimate Trinitarian theology and tritheism.
Legitimate Trinitarian theology versus tritheism. That's a mouthful. Legitimate, this needs to be a t-shirt. Legitimate Trinitarian theology versus tritheism.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, what the heck does that mean?
Yeah.
Tritheism means there's three gods.
Right.
And that is, of course, not what Christians believe, right?
Christians believe there's one God.
Christians believe there's one God. So legitimate Trinitarian theology would mean it's got to be historically, biblically based. It's orthodox. It's not heretical. It's that's what makes it legitimate. And Trinitarian means there's a tripersonal active being that created the world, brought it into existence, and sustains it, and will judge it at the end of time. Is that right?
That's right.
So fascinating topic, because I think a lot of people come to the Trinity and it is so puzzling. It's like, what in the world is going on here?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I can see why you'd be attracted to that topic, because hello, like hugely important.
Hugely important. Many people would say central to the Christian in the way that a hub is central to a wheel. So many things feed directly into that. And if that hub collapses, the whole wheel collapses. Mm-hmm. And having my background in both philosophy and theology, it occurred to me that this idea of the Trinity should be theological and biblical. It should derive from the Bible. That's my MO as an evangelical. So it should be biblical. But when we take the next step and we try to think about what the Bible's saying about God, it's inevitably a philosophical step. Now we're trying to come up with analogies to understand how all of what the Bible says about God makes sense. We're immediately presented with this apparent contradiction, this very unwieldy thought that there's one God. How many gods? Let's count gods. We Christians, we start counting and we get to one and we stop. We don't go beyond that. But nonetheless, we say, but there are three divine persons. There are three divine persons, and person does not mean God in this sense. So the three divine persons that we encounter in the New Testament in particular, very clearly, Jesus comes preaching and teaching about his Father who's in heaven. Everybody knows that he's talking about the God of Israel, the one God that the Jews have worshipped from Mount Sinai to his day. So they knew that he was talking about his Father was Yahweh of Israel, right? Mm-hmm. But then the Gospels present Jesus himself as being fully divine. Paul, the apostle, outside of the Gospels, he says this in Colossians 1, the fullness of deity dwells in him in bodily form. Jesus goes so far as to say, when you've seen me, you've seen the Father. I am in the Father and the Father is in me. He wasn't claiming to be the Father, however. He was only claiming to be as divine as the Father, having the same divinity. And so the New Testament talks very consistently about Jesus's full divinity. He's not God-ish. He's not very God-like. We go so far as to say he is God. And that's a legitimate, proper thing to say about Jesus. We don't say he's a second God, because there is no such thing as a second God. But he is distinct from the Father. He's not the Father, because when he says to his disciples, I'm going to pray to the Father, he's not lying to them. He's not going to talk to himself for a bit. When he says the Father sent me, he's not lying to them. He's telling them that someone else sent me. When he says the Father loves the Son, when he says I'm leaving you, but I will send another helper, namely the Holy Spirit, he's speaking there of a third divine person who carries on God's mission of salvation and redemption and all of that. And so in himself has all of God's power and wisdom. And so the New Testament presents three distinct persons. They really are distinct persons, but they're not divided persons. They're not separate beings. So now the difficult, apparently contradictory question we have is, how is it that there's one divine being simultaneously presented as three divine persons, three distinct divine persons, not one divine person playing three roles, sort of consistently deceiving us, pretending to be different divine persons. That would just be divine deception, but really three divine persons in loving communion. They really do love each other the way that a husband loves a wife. That's one loving another. And then a husband and wife together loving their child. That's two loving a third. That apparently is what the New Testament communicates to us about the Father, Son, and Spirit, that there really is interpersonal love, not a sort of self-love, but interpersonal love, and yet there's only one divine being. So that's obviously, just thinking about it, the Bible presents us with that data, but doesn't tell us exactly how to think those things simultaneously. And so the next step is inevitably a philosophical step. And in my reading, I found a lot of people, both historical and contemporary, that seemed to me to just be tritheists, that they were just inevitably saying, here's the only way we can understand it. We Christians have to say that there are three gods. And they just bite the bullet on that. And my response was, no, we can't do that. We absolutely cannot do that, for not just biblical reasons, but also serious philosophical reasons. We can't do that. And so I wanted to think about that question and understand what the difference was.
Not for so what are the philosophical reasons? I got the biblical data. So what's the philosophical data that I'm missing?
Sure. Here's one really important reason I think that we ought not say that there are three gods. The biblical characterization of God is that he is maximally great. And so we could find a number of different chapters and verses that talk about God's maximal greatness in a number of ways. His knowledge is inexhaustible, right? David would say in the Psalms, there's nothing that God doesn't know. And so in theology, we say he's omniscient, that is all-knowing. God is inexhaustibly powerful. He never runs out of energy. There's never any task that he cannot accomplish if he wills to. And so we say he's all powerful or omnipotent and so on. And so God is maximally great. And again, we can search all the prophets and apostles and find all of the data for this, but if you've read the Bible long enough, you can just ask yourself the question, do you think a prophet or apostle would ever admit that God is limited in some sense? Like, God knows a lot of things, but he doesn't know everything. God can do a lot of things, but he can't do everything. No, biblically, that doesn't even seem like an open option. They speak of God in such absolutely effusive ways that it just leaves no room for any lack or limitation in God. And so God is maximally great, we would say. Okay, so now here's the question. If the Father, Son, and Spirit are all equally divine, that is, they're all maximally great, and yet divided particular individuals, like three men, then we would run into certain absurd consequences. So we might say, let's say the Father and the Son are separate maximally great gods. We might say, can the Son keep some secret knowledge from the Father? Well, on the one hand, the answer is no, because the Father's all-knowing. So there's nothing secret that the Father doesn't know. On the other hand, the answer would be yes, because the Son is all-powerful. So you and I can't keep secrets. You might be able to keep a secret from people close to you. You might be very well trained to be able to keep secrets from the CIA, despite that they're, threatening your family and pulling out fingernails. But you can't ever keep a secret from God. He doesn't have to do anything to you to get the secret out. He immediately knows all of your secrets because he's all-knowing. Only God can actually keep a secret because God is all-powerful. We couldn't trick him to tell us the truth. We couldn't perceive in his divine mind or threaten him or do anything to get the secret out of him. So if Jesus, the second God, is just as divine as the first God, well, then the answer again would be yes, he can keep a secret because he's all-powerful. So now you have a situation, potential state of affairs, in which the answer to the question, can Jesus keep a secret from the Father, is both yes and no. And if it's both yes and no, that's a contradiction. That's a clear contradiction.
If it's in the same sense, yeah.
In the same sense.
Yeah, okay.
And so that would be an absurd state of affairs, which means a state of affairs that can't be real. The only way to have three gods is to say that they're not maximally great. So polytheism never involves a God that's maximally great. All of their gods, even if you have a highest God, they all have limitations.
Yeah.
But that's not going to fit with biblical Christianity.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the Muslims would come along and say, see, we're better. We can make sense of that.
They do. They say, see, we're better, and this is why you should opt for monotheism. But here's a real problem for Islam, a philosophical problem for Islam. If we Christians say that the God of the Bible is maximally great, let's go with the name Yahweh, that's the biblical name, and Muslims say, no, Allah is the true God. The Bible's been corrupted, and only the Quran is pure, and Allah is the true God. And Allah is maximally great, and they're separate ideas altogether. Here's the problem for Islam. We might ask a Muslim theologian, is God maximally loving? Among his great-making properties, he's maximally knowing, he's maximally powerful. Is another great-making property is to be loving? Is he maximally loving? And they would say yes. I think Islamic theologians would say yes. Allah is in fact maximally loving. He has no limitations. Okay, here's the problem.
When you say great, let me slow you down really quick. You say great making. So some folks might be hanging on and then get to that part and go, wait, what do you mean by great making? And I think what you're saying is, we're talking about maximal greatness. Just grant that God is maximally great. Ontological argument, right?
Yeah.
And one of the great making properties, by that you mean something that makes the greatest thing, is being loving. That's what you're saying, right?
That's right.
Fair to say?
Yeah.
Okay.
A great making property, theologians, that's a kind of a technical term of theology. Something just intuitively, we don't have to get, you just can't get too scientific about this, unfortunately. You have to employ a little bit of intuition. What intuitively is it better to have? It's better to have power and ability than to lack it. It's better to have knowledge than to be ignorant. It's better to have love than to lack love. So there's no such thing as being maximally evil, because evil isn't a thing to have. Evil is an expression of something that we lack, namely we lack holiness and love and those good things, right? So it's like darkness is the absence of light. It's not the presence of some alternative substance.
So this depends on a privation view of evil. Like evil is a privation. Okay.
Yeah, and in the same way that lacking power is not the presence of something contrary to power. It's or impotence, we would say, is not the presence of power, but it's lack of power. Ignorance
so
is not
evil is like weakness, you mean? Weakness is the absence of strength.
Exactly. Exactly. And so God being maximally great, if we have a concept of any being maximally great, we would just ask, what is it better to have than not? And we have to engage our intuition. So intuitively, I think Islamic and Christian theologians would agree that God must be by nature maximally loving, perfectly loving. When God loves, he never does so inadequately or imperfectly as we humans do. We never love perfectly. God
otherwise that would be a deficiency, which cannot be in a maximally great being.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So here's the problem for Islamic theology. Is God actually maximally loving or only potentially maximally loving? Well, actually, God isn't potentially all-knowing eternally. He's eternally all-knowing. He's not potentially all-powerful. Like God, if you really work at it, you could become all-powerful. You're almost there. No, that would never be something.
There's a certificate program. You can get it online.
Right. So God doesn't develop more power, develop more knowledge. He doesn't develop more love. He's not potentially maximally loving. He's actually maximally loving. Well, in Islam, God can't love, Allah can't love until there's an object of his love. And so he has to create someone to love, and then he can express himself as being actually maximally loving. But if he has to create somebody to express his love, then he's not maximally free. He is required to do something to express his love. God isn't required to do anything. God is maximally free. A maximal view of God would have God being maximally free. You and I aren't maximally free. There are things that we have to do, right? You have to respirate and keep breathing to keep living. You don't have the choice to stop breathing and keep living.
Right.
God doesn't have to make any sorts of choices to sustain himself. He doesn't have to do anything for any reason. He's maximally free. And so if we have a maximal view of God, which Muslims have, or at least claim to have theologically, then you have to have something like Trinitarian theology. Because if God is an eternal lover by nature, there must be an object of his eternal love, namely an eternal beloved. And this is how we would express the idea of the Father and the Son in Trinitarian theology, without separating the being of God into two parts. And so it would seem just philosophically, there's better reason to be something like a Trinitarian to start than a strict Unitarian.
Yeah. So that's a double doozy. You just got two for the price of one. What you did was just take out Judaism and Islam at the same time. I mean, a wrong understanding of Judaism, I would say.
Yeah, fair. Wrong understanding. Judaism, as I understand it, would be something that develops in the second temple period. That's the temple built, after the Babylonian captivity, after the end of the Old Testament, or at the end of the Old Testament.
586 or something like that on.
Right. And the time that Jesus is preaching, we see
BC, by the way, BC.
Exactly. Around the time that Jesus is preaching, we see the advent, I think, of what we would now call Judaism. It's not necessarily the religion of the Old Testament.
Fair enough. Yeah.
The religion of Paul.
Right.
When he was Saul.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, Judaism, we might say, is just as old as Christianity, if not. Okay, these are going to be fighting words, and I can imagine somebody getting about this.
Well, please don't be controversial on the Republican professor, because we are just we're all about pleasing people and just making everybody feel like there's no controversy anywhere ever.
Okay, good to know.
Just say what you need to say, just like John Mayer said. Say what you need to say.
I, at least for the sake of charity, I at least like to recognize. I'll tell you, what I think at any time, but I at least like to recognize that there are thoughtful people who I don't dismiss out of hand that might disagree, and I'm happy to continue talking with them. But that's the idea. So
fair enough.
So Judaism is no older than, if not a bit younger than Christianity, because Judaism, as we know it as a religion today, actually has intrinsic to it some claims about Jesus, namely that he is not the Messiah of Israel. If you're making claims about Jesus, that is consequent to, that is after the Christian claim has been made. Islam is the same way. It makes anti-Christian, anti-Jewish claims. Christianity and Judaism have to exist for Islam to then have those claims be central to their theology. So as I see it, one way to think of it is that Christianity is actually older. And as an evangelical Christian, of course, this is controversial, but it doesn't matter. Everybody knows that evangelical biblical Christians would say that Christianity is actually the right expression of biblical religion. So the whole Old Testament is about Jesus Christ. And so thinking that Jesus is not the Messiah and having a religion based on that would be a total misunderstanding of the Hebrew Bible.
Yes. And for those listening who are thinking at this point, yeah, but doesn't this just depend on which books are in the Bible and how that all came about? Absolutely. Absolutely. Right. But that's a bracketed conversation over here. And you have to do that. You have to move through the topic, and you can take note and kind of nod and go, okay, that's a door over there. I need to go over there at some point. I need to go over here at some point, maybe study some logic over here. Nature of contradictions, study the history of Islam over here. Okay. But you can't do everything at once. I mean, you're doing quite a lot actually right now. And that's just the nature of the discussion. You kind of take note of what you need to come back to, and you can come back to it later. Is that fair to say? Okay.
Yeah. And that's been how I've approached a lot of things.
Yeah. So it's not like you have to accomplish everything at the same time. You can't. It's just impossible to talk about thoughtfully talk about the Trinity, which is a huge thing. I mean, some people might think you're spending way too much time on this. This is crazy. Well, but it's huge. It's a huge thing. It may be the hugest thing in history, right? I mean, you're talking
Sure.
about how we divide the dates. This is 2022 after.
Right.
It's not after the Big Bang.
Right.
It's not after some Michael Shermer would say the first human came from a non-human. Anyway, okay, so how did you say it? What was the word you used? Your dad was a nominal
Yeah.
Hindu? Is
Right.
that what you said?
That's right.
Does your Indian background, ethnic background, both your parents are Indian?
My mother's not. My mother's mainly Italian.
Italian. Oh, okay. So did your father's background at all, and did that kind of shape your concern about getting the Trinity right ever? Or was that just because
That's a really
a lot of people don't think about the Trinity very much. And when I thought of the Trinity as a topic for this, I immediately thought of you, because I think it's because when we talked through the years, you expressed interest in it, and I remember lodging that in my soul, like, I'm so glad that Sanjay is interested in that, because I don't think I want to do that work, but I know it has to be done, and I'm so glad he's chasing that down.
thank you for saying that, and I feel the same
Yeah.
way about you. And things are so politically charged, and understanding politics and economics and things like that. I'm very much a novice, and
Mhm.
sometimes I pretend to have understanding about those things and make big statements. But then, as I'm being more realistic, I realize I don't understand this stuff, and um, so I know the feeling that you're talking about. I feel the same way about you, and I could pick out other people that I'm so glad you're doing that. I'm never going to do that. Yeah.
So
So,
so yeah, I mean, it's a refreshing because every once in a while I have anxiety about it, to be honest with you. I'll be reading and I'll be like, this is just weird. The Trinity is just weird.
yeah.
And I can understand why someone would think it's weird.
Yeah.
I mean, the Father and the Son, and where's the Mother? And like,
Right.
does he have not any sisters, and the Holy Spirit, and it just existed that way from eternity? And
Right.
it just sounds weird, because we're ordinarily thinking of a father and a son as a human thing.
Yeah.
It's male. It
Yeah.
sounds male. So what do you say to that?
Yeah. Um, it is weird. It's absolutely weird. And it's okay to say that it's weird, even for committed Christians. We should admit that, and try to become a little bit more comfortable with the weirdness.
Weird
Uh,
doesn't mean wrong. It never has meant wrong.
right.
There's a lot
Um,
of things that are weird that are real.
yeah. And given our limited and in some ways intellectually perverted perspective on things, we should expect that a true understanding of God would strike us as weird, because we're sort of out of step with it and limited. But
Humans are weird.
absolutely. Absolutely. Reality is weird. When you think about, the big questions, metaphysics, and you get into the deepest questions of physics, reality, it's weird. So that's
Fair enough. Yeah, chemistry
right.
is weird.
So if your theology is just so sort of mundane and easily packaged, that might be an indication that you're not quite doing it right. Not to say that we should just delve into weirdness and mysticism and just be in this persistent state of confusion and call it depth or something like that. But we should expect some of this, and to just be a little bit comfortable with it. So anyway, to your question, Father, Son,
Yeah.
the Bible presents us with that terminology. Jesus talks about God as my Father, and in John 5, they say to Jesus, "You keep talking about God as my Father, not as our Father. Our Father." That's a nice way of talking. That's a religious way of talking. We can deal with that. You're not talking that way. You're saying my Father. as if you are uniquely related to him in a peculiar way that's only right for you. In John 5, they say, you're making yourself out to be equal with God. They picked up on his meaning. When he said, God is not, I'm not speaking of God, our Father. I'm talking about my Father. You imagine I'm not in the room and a bunch of people are bad-mouthing me or acting like they know me when they don't. And my son walks into the room and he hears misconceptions about me, slander about me. People are making all sorts of statements about me. And he might get just incensed by this and say, hey, everybody stop. Everybody stop. You don't know what you're saying. Okay. Who are you?
Right.
My Father sent me. He's my Father. I know him. You don't know him. So just listen for a second, right? That's what Jesus is doing. And they pick up
in John 5. In John 5.
Yeah, and John 5 in particular is one of the key places, but in many places. And
yeah, he talks both ways. I mean, there's other, the famous Lord's Prayer, right? Our Father in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That's in Matthew 6, I believe, right?
Yeah.
There's a version of it in Luke. It's shorter. It's not in Mark. Mark is the earliest, but from a historical perspective, you're looking at these historical documents, right?
Right.
And you're saying there is a tradition and it's legit. It's in the Gospels. John's later, but it's still legit. He was an apostle. He was a disciple of Jesus. He was there. And you're saying there's also this way that Jesus talks as if it's, yes, our Father, but it's, no, there's something else also there. There's a deeper dimension, and it is reflected in his language of my Father, right?
Absolutely.
John 5. Okay.
And when he teaches, so the apostles would unpack this even more. When he teaches to address God, as you mentioned in the Lord's Prayer, as our Father, we have the right to call God our Father, in that claim is embedded in Jesus's primary claim that he is my Father. And so there's a very important phrase all throughout the New Testament. It's called being in Christ. That little preposition in, we can think of it as being in Jesus, and it uses that bodily language.
Yeah.
But not like positionally bodily language, but being in him in the larger sense, being in his sonship, in his unique, even genetic kind of relationship to the Father. And so we are in that. And so in that, we have boldness. We can address God as our Father, not just because of my own benevolence, not just because, hey, I'm a good guy. God, I love you, and you love me. You've adopted me as your son. It's not on my own 2 feet that I call God my Father, but only in Jesus Christ, derivative of his right. His right. Nobody gave him the right to call God his Father. Like, I don't give my son Nathaniel the right to call me Father. He has that right by birth. If I say to him, don't call me your father, I disown you, I'm doing something wrong. I never have the right to take, he can call me his Father. He has that by birth. I don't give that to him. And so that's the New Testament idea, that Jesus Christ derives his very nature from the Father himself. So in John 1, John calls Jesus not just the Son of God, which he certainly calls him the Son of God, but also the radiance of the Father. So the New Testament gives us this other analogy, very important analogy for the Trinity. So think about the Father like the sun, speaking of the star at the center of our solar system. Do you ever have the sun without the sunlight? No, of course. As long as the sun is there, so there's sunlight. Do you ever have sunlight without the sun? No, of course not. As long as there's sunlight, it's coming from the sun. They always go together. And they are intrinsically integral to one another. In fact, if we were to get into like an impervious spaceship that could fly into the sun without burning up, we would come to some fuzzy boundary where we don't know whether we're in the sun or we're in the sunlight. And this fuzzy boundary where they overlap. In Trinitarian theology, that's how we think of the Father and the Son. We think of the Son as deriving from, being begotten of the Father, coming from the Father, but not being separate in being from the Father. So that's why the fullness of deity dwells in him in bodily form. My son Nathaniel is fully human. Why is he fully 100? He's just as human as me. He's not less human than me. He's fully human because he's begotten of humans. So Jesus Christ is fully divine because he's begotten of the Father. Now, the difference between Nathanael's begetting and Jesus Christ's eternal begetting is that with Nathanael's begetting, it involves my wife, of course. It involves a moment of conception, and he begins to exist. When egg and sperm come together in the womb, now the human exists, and the clock starts ticking. There is no divine mother, remember, because there cannot be a species of gods that are maximally great. If there can only be one or none. There cannot be more than one. And so God does not consort with anyone, doesn't conceive with anyone. There's no divine egg and sperm to be broken off from his impartible being. He's not made of parts. And so when he donates his genetics, he doesn't donate part of his genetics. He donates everything that he is. So the fullness of deity dwells in Jesus. So we imagine that the Son is coming forth from the divine womb, just like human children do. But when does that happen? Not at a moment, not on a birthday, but eternally. So he's eternally begotten of the Father, eternally coming forth. And so God the Father is distinct from Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is sent, but he carries with him the fullness of the divine genetics. That's why Jesus says to his disciples say, okay, you tell us all this stuff about God. We're willing to believe you if you just show us God. And he says to them in that moment, do you not understand? When you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Because I am in the Father, where do I come from? From the genetics, from the very bosom of the Father, the womb of the Father. I derive from the Father, but yet I contain the fullness of the Father. The Father is in me. I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. And so the Son analogy, which the Bible presents and early Trinitarians really developed, is the analogy that the star and its radiance, and then we might add its heat. It's felt, kind of experienced on the earth. We feel the heat. So the felt sort of experienced part of God, we might say, is the Holy Spirit. And so you have the Son radiating out light and heat, and so the Father radiates forth the Son and the Spirit into the world without parting himself, without dividing himself. The analogy isn't perfect because the sunlight is a degraded version of the light of the center of the sun. The heat that we feel on the earth is certainly a degraded version. We don't feel the full light and heat of the sun on the earth. We would be incinerated. Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit are not degraded gods with a lowercase g. They're fully God. So the analogy helps us a little bit, but we just have to keep in mind that Jesus isn't like a Titan, like Hercules, like half God, half man.
Yes. I really I hesitated to say anything because you were just on this roll here. I think you covered. I was about to ask you about the Holy Spirit, and then you said the Holy Spirit was this. Did you say it this way? The radiation of the Son from the Father in the world. Does that sound right?
In the analogy, something like the radiated heat, just using the analogy.
Well, it's analogy all the way down because the Son and the Father is an analogy. It's also not perfect.
Right.
Really, a lot of folks need to think a little bit more carefully about analogies per se.
Yeah.
When you study logic, introduction to logic usually has informal fallacies. One is weak analogy. And so I go into this a bit about analogies, the nature of an analogy. We always say it's not a perfect analogy, as if there is such a thing as a perfect analogy. It's kind of like when people say too many people are dying from crack. It's like, well, what's the perfect number? Like,
right.
Isn't the perfect number 0? But it's just the way we talk is just weird sometimes.
Sure.
So the analogy of the Father Son, what would you say to someone? Well, is there anything you wanted to add about the Holy Spirit there? Did I say it wrong?
No, I think that's right. Yeah.
Okay. So spend time on analogies. I would say to people, like, that's a door over here. You can come back to that. We really do need to think about what analogies are because they're really critical for our being able to think about things. But okay, so it's revealed to us by God in the Bible in this analogy. So in other words, is that a reason to say it's not a perfect analogy? Obviously, that's almost redundant to say that. But God himself is saying this is the best analogy you're going to get. If you try to understand it any other way, it's going to be somehow defective. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah.
Because
I
I,
think
I maybe a woman is listening to this and they're thinking, she's thinking, let me get my pronouns right. She might be thinking that this is two men here talking, and they just are. They're obviously, because they're men. They don't understand how it makes women feel when Christianity is presented as Father, Son, and then this like gender neutral Holy Spirit.
Mhm.
What in the world am I supposed to do with that? Now, a lot of women go along with it, but a lot of women seem bothered by it. So
Yeah.
what can you say about someone who might have that concern that we're just missing something because we're men,
Yeah.
that there's really something, there's a deeper weirdness that's not healthy, and
Yeah.
we're missing it because we just can't see it. Standpoint epistemology, where we're missing it.
Yeah. Yeah. I suppose there's a couple things. So in creation, as we find in the opening chapters of Genesis, we see that the male and the female were created in the image of God. The single image of God is reflected in this binary way, in the male and the female. That's importantly embedded in creation. So it seems to me that you know all about this stuff and the politics of this stuff, the sort of very gender fluid contemporary perspective that there's more than two genders and genders can change and all of that. Biblically, for biblical Christians, that's very hard for us to make sense of. It's embedded in creation. Notice that race is not embedded in creation. I don't mean to go on a tangent, but I just do mean to say.
I'm very glad you said that. That's perfect. Yeah.
Yeah,
Gender's there, but not race.
but not race. So we can't make this analogy to say, oh, you don't mind if in American politics, we all know this, we have these terms called black and white, which involve not just African and European history, but a whole, or African or European ethnicity, but a whole sort of history that goes with it. And so, and we say, well, you don't mind a black person and a white person getting married, but two men getting married, all of a sudden, you're all up in arms over that. Well, there's a very fundamental, different way in which we view gender and race in Christian theology. Gender is intrinsic to the created order. Race is not. Race is has to do with the migration of people groups and the accidents of history. And if people had migrated in different directions and certain groups had merged or separated in different ways, we would literally have different races, but we would still have male and female, right? We still have male and female. There's no getting around that biologically or even socially. There's no getting around that. It's part of the social fabric.
And both male and female, right at the beginning, are equally created in the image of God. It's not like, I mean, male is first temporally in the narration.
Right.
Literarily, the male comes first.
Mm-hmm.
That's literature. That's the literary. That doesn't mean that that's what's most important, or it doesn't mean he's primary and in an unequal sense of metaphysics, right? Or the reality. Metaphysics just means the reality. That's how I'm using the term. So male and female, if you read Genesis 1 and 2, the man comes first. God creates the man first. Then he creates the woman.
From the man.
From the physical stuff of the man. But
which
obviously.
So that
okay, all right. Species. How's it important?
So that they're the same species.
So they're the
that
same
they're not.
species.
So if the woman were created
equally human and equally in the image of God.
Right, equally human of the same species. If God had created Eve separately and distinctly, we could make the case that men and women are distinct interbreeding species. And if you have distinct species, now you have grounds for discrimination. So in my home, the children eat at the table, the dog eats under the table. The justification for that is that the children are human and deserve human dignity and have human rights. And so eating at the table is proper for them. The dog, we could do it with the dog if we wanted to, but we certainly don't have to. Nobody would come in our house and think injustice. If we tell the dog, get down from the table, get under the table, everybody's okay with that. not because we're anti-dog, but because that's appropriate and proper to dogs, because there's totally different species. If they see me do that to my son and put the dog up at the table and say, get down under the table, then they say, what are you doing? Right? That's clearly flouting the dignity of my son's humanity. So it's vitally important that the man and the woman are related in that sense, that the woman is taken from the man. But then, of course, you have the first conception, and then a man comes from the woman. And so how does Adam and Eve's son get his humanity from the humanity of his mother and his father, right? And so that makes humanity united, so that we're literally biologically related, and no human can look at another human and say, you're in any sense lesser to me, or any distinctive in value. Racism suggests that something like humanity is broken up into something like different species, and certain things are appropriate for one species and not appropriate for another species.
That's really insightful. That's really good. Also, the image of God is passed down from the mother. And now, if you're not following this, you just go back to Genesis and read the first chapters.
Right.
There's textual warrant for everything we're saying here. The image of God is a reason for capital punishment in Genesis 9. After, hold on, let me make sure I got it right. After the flood, I believe. Hold up. No, sorry. Yes. After the flood. I was thinking of Cain and Abel in Genesis 4, but Cain doesn't get the death penalty. So Cain kills Abel. These are the sons of Adam and Eve. And Cain probably deserved the death penalty, but God had grace on him, just as God had grace on Adam and Eve. He said, in this day that you eat of the fruit, you will die. The word is yom there. So on that day, you could say, but they didn't die that day. Something else did. So God had grace on them, and he had grace on Cain. Then fast forward, there's a big flood. And at the end of the flood, there is this warrant for the death penalty. And it says specifically in there that it's because of the image of God. So in other words, what you're saying is the mother is also passing not only the humanity, but I guess what that means is the humanity carries with it the image of God. So that's right. For men and women.
Exactly.
Anybody that's human. Okay.
The full, when we speak of human rights and human dignity and all of these things that we so value in ethics and politics, and we should value, ultimately, I think the only good justification, I'm familiar with some secular justifications of the notion of human rights and human value and things. I don't think they wash. I think ultimately it's got to be rooted in something like what you say, the image of God. We are bearers of the image of God. Women don't have it in a secondary sense. They don't have it in a lesser sense. Men don't have it in a secondary or lesser sense. If you're a radical feminist, you might think so. Not so. Nobody of any particular ethnicity or cultural group has it in a secondary sense. By birth, by nature, we have it in the same sense. And so women culturally can become second-class citizens, even in the church.
Sure.
That's a cultural mistake. That's a cultural mistake.
That's mistreatment.
It is mistreatment. We might call it sexism. As I see it, the gospel doesn't leave any room for that. That doesn't mean that radical feminist expressions of how to counteract and correct sexism are themselves right. But in any case, in the biblical view, women are in no way secondary. And so we see this in creation, that the man and the woman are both together created in the divine image. And what that indicates is that God, of course, is not biologically male. Although we have the term father, and I use the term father, I don't call God mother. Some theologians say we should do that. I don't think so. The Bible doesn't present that, but I don't in any sense think that God is biologically male. I mean, think about, again, the terminology of John chapter 1. The Son comes from the bosom of the Father. I have no qualms. The Bible doesn't say this, but I actually have no problem with saying what I said before. We might, by analogy, say that the Son came from the womb of the Father. Now, of course, fathers don't have wombs.
Yeah.
And so the
Well,
son
what if,
comes.
what if they say a divine parent? Because I hear people talking like that.
I think that there's value, and I guess I could think more about this, but the biblical language is father. And if parent were just as appropriate or just as useful, maybe the Bible would say parent. I'm not saying that that's wrong or bad, or I wouldn't
Right.
announce anybody over that. But
No.
but
I see what you're saying. I mean, there are, I think there are just a few, I don't know how many exactly, but not very many female metaphors for for God. Like when in Matthew, when Jesus is crying over Jerusalem and he says, "Oh, I have longed to gather you like a hen gathers her chicks," and that's a
right,
female. That's but it's not very often. But it doesn't mean that Jesus is saying I'm I'm a woman, or I'm the God is a mother exactly. But yeah, it's tricky. It's hard to know exactly where to draw the line, I guess.
yeah, and we've got this father son, and we might think, oh, male male. Of course, it's
Yeah.
the Bible doesn't present it as male male. Um, the divine father is divine father. We do use the pronouns he biblically. It does use the masculine. It even uses, I mean, for the Holy Spirit, Jesus doesn't say ta pneumahagias, which would be grammatically correct using the neuter article. He says ha pneumahagias. He uses the masculine article. So he actually uses he in reference to the Holy Spirit. It would be right in Greek to say it, because pneuma or spirit is neuter, neither masculine nor feminine.
Right.
And so, I mean, that makes it even worse. So biblically, you have he, and he. So I can understand feminists feeling, especially culturally speaking, as the church has had bad, maybe even patriarchal, abusive expressions. It's happened.
Yeah.
And feel as if the Christian language itself sanctions that. I don't think that that's true. Consider this.
Yes.
All of Christians are considered the bride of Christ. I don't know if that makes you feel uncomfortable.
It does.
Right. And I felt that way.
Especially when Paul talks about being in Christ.
Right.
It's a little odd. I mean, it's obviously not sexual. That would not make sense for the bride of Christ anyway, if you're paying attention to basic anatomy. But yes, the bride of Christ is odd, and I've felt that way a lot. And we're supposed to be married to Christ, But
right. So
I mean, but that's just an analogy. It's not. There's a lot of analogies. There's a lot of analogies in Scripture.
Exactly, and it's touching on. I mean, in the marital union, two people who are dedicated to each other, yes, relationally, spiritually, emotionally, they express that relation with the deepest physical intimacy in sex that, it's not possible for any two humans to get more deeply physically intimate. It's a reflection of the deep emotional, social, relational union that's happening. That's why we shouldn't do it indiscriminately or promiscuously, because you're really breaking yourself off into pieces and emptying yourself.
The very last chapter of the Bible, Revelation 21. Wait, is it 22 or 21? That I think 22. It's okay. So the second to the last chapter is Revelation 21, new heavens and new earth. The new Jerusalem is presented as a beautiful bride. So the polity, the new polis is magnificently dressed, beautiful, lovely bride.
Yeah.
And it's just wonderful. Now it's okay. There's all these analogies, and if you study theology, this is what you study. You study this history and philosophy and the biblical text. It's great. I love what you said about race. Going back to that, the reason we're talking about this, because I didn't even have to set you up for this. You just went right there. Is human rights. So if people, they're wondering, what does this have to do with politics? What does it have to do with American politics? This is the view of human rights that Abraham Lincoln had. When he looked at Black people, he saw humans made in the image of God. And this is, he wasn't like a biblical scholar or anything, but He was self-taught, reading the Bible, reading Euclid and Shakespeare. That was the guy that ended slavery. That was his training. That was his college. That was his high school. Logic, the Bible, and literature. And so this is tremendously relevant to the proper way, I think, to think about rights. And you nailed it exactly about race and species and gender. And so it's all relevant. And we're barely scratching the surface, I think, but we've done a pretty good job of laying stuff out. Would you say that well, if you screw up the nature of rights and the nature of the human person, it's going to have disastrous consequences. And the really horrible places on earth, they always screw that up. It's not an accident.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I think sometimes we were talking about India, which is not a country I grew up in, and I know it a bit as an outsider, though I've been there many times and I have family there. South Asia in general, is a place, as people are probably aware, of great disparity. Great disparity.
Yes.
There are people who are absorbently rich and considered even valuable, and then there are people at the very lowest level of a social structure. In Hinduism, they're called untouchables, who can't rise above any station other than cleaning toilets and that sort of work. Can't marry outside of that. And there's a very strict hierarchy. That's rooted in Hindu theology and in the Hindu view of Hindu view of different levels of human worth and value, and you sort of work it out in this life and then return in the next life, and hopefully it's at a higher station. But you stay within that structure. We don't break away from that structure because it's what the universe demands. It's what God demands, and it sanctions. And I've seen it in India. It sanctions the mistreatment of the people at the lowest level as if they are really a different species. Like you eat under the table because you're a dog. I and my children will eat at the table. If we do that with dogs, we're fine. If we do that with other humans, now we've done something fundamentally wrong. So I would say one reason that I could never be a Hindu is it would be something like that. It would, from what I understand, even if I weren't a Christian, the gospel has so transformed the understanding of human value and dignity in the world that even secular people have this notion that humans are intrinsically valuable, intrinsically worthy, cannot be used and abused. You cannot have a hierarchy. We do it anyway. Of course, we do it in all sorts of ways.
Yeah.
But in theory, we know that it's wrong. And that very much derives from the teachings of the early church. That is not the way that just thoughtful people think. I mean, the Roman Empire, the Persian Empire,
no,
these were major movements in human history that were very constructive, did a lot of culturally wonderful, incredible things. They did not have that notion of human rights. There was certainly a hierarchy.
That's right.
And I take it that it's the teaching of the early church that changed the whole world's thinking about this stuff.
That's totally right, I think. Of course, you can get into the weeds on the details in history and stuff like that. But I like to go back to just reminding folks that your problems, there's a tendency to, I think, overthink the mistreatment problem. And we talk about race and gender, and those are really sexy topics. Sexual orientation recently. Now that's even passe. Now it's like gender identity. So it's tough to keep up with what the kids are doing these days. But when Cain killed Abel, it's not because Abel was a different race. The first kinds of mistreatment, the what mistreatment really is pretty basic. And what rights really are pretty basic. You have a right not to be murdered. You have a right not to be stolen from. There's no reference to race at all. You have a right not to be kidnapped. That's in Exodus 21, one chapter after the Ten Commandments. That right there condemns the African slave trade in America. You have a right to faithfulness of your spouse. You have a right to rest regularly. It's kind of strange to think of this, but I love the way the Bible does it. It doesn't complicate it by some kind of weird obsession of race or gender. It's, you know, and people are constantly finding ways to mistreat other people. That's just the way it is. And it happens in many different societies in different ways, but at basic root level, take for example the Soviet Union. You never think of, people never talk about the Soviet Union as like white supremacy or whatever, but the Soviet Union was fairly monolithically, I think what most people would say, white, I think, fairly, but there was tremendous inequality and mistreatment of people and tremendous suffering. And I think it's because they were there was at root level, like you were saying about Hindu theology in India, a mistaken understanding of what people are and our purpose on earth. But even when you have it right, like we have it, the Declaration of Independence is wonderful and great. Tremendously flawed people trying to execute this thing, but that's just the way it is. I mean, it's always been that way.
For sure.
Cain kills Abel right away. It's amazing. So is there anything else you wanted to add about that? Oh, what you know, tell us where you teach. What kind of classes do you teach? What do you enjoy? What do you enjoy teaching? What's your favorite class?
Yeah.
What are your students like?
I teach at Moody Bible Institute, downtown Chicago. So
I've heard of that.
Wonderful place to teach.
It's famous, very famous.
Yeah, it's a great city. It's a beautiful city. It's, you know, it has a reputation for being, you know, freezing cold, and being in Southern California, I didn't know cold until I moved here. So yeah, roughly half the year is pretty uncomfortably cold, but the other half is wonderful, and the school is in a beautiful setting downtown Chicago. I teach regularly. I have an intro to philosophy class. We don't have a philosophy major, but we do intro to philosophy for all of our ministry majors.
That's good.
I do an apologetics course where it's very much an introductory course, but hopefully in their curriculum, they've gotten a lot of historical and even a little bit of scientific kind of development in their theological thinking, and I kind of try to bring that together. I do that for seniors. Philosophy comes early on for sophomores. And then in addition to that, I have an elective on Trinitarian theology that I've done every year, so I'm going to do it again this fall. I'm really looking forward to it. And we have a brand new class I'm also looking forward to in the fall. It's a course that we've called Biblical Ethics. And so it's an ethics course. So that has to do with the philosophy of right and wrong, everything we've been talking about, human rights and those sorts of questions of what you ought to do and what you ought not to do. Of course, that's all ethics, as people know. And we've tagged it biblical ethics, because what we want to do is we really want to do that integrative work of bringing together the study of ethics with a biblical perspective. So it won't necessarily be going through all of the chapters of Leviticus and talking about all of the sort of moral laws as distinguished from certain ritualistic laws or something. There'll be a little bit of that, but it's not. It's an ethics course, but it's hopefully deeply integrated with the biblical perspective on things. So some of these things will come up. Why do Christians say that? What justification do we have for saying that people of all tribes, as you said, the Bible doesn't even have the word race, but it has some similar words like nation, tribe, tongue. Some of them are more cultural.
Ethnicity, yeah.
Ethnos, right?
Yep, right.
Yeah, and that word doesn't exactly mean ethnicity as we mean it today. That word is transformed a little bit, used in different contexts, but it's got similar words. And so we'll talk about those sorts of things. What does the Bible have to say? How should we think about it in our context, not just the American context? Because as I mentioned, we've got this sort of black-white distinction. And you asked about my students. Many of my students, we have a lot of East Asian students. And so they come from a very different context. A lot of South Korean students, more and more Chinese students are coming to Moody. And because the church is growing so rapidly in East Asia, some trickling of South Asian students, I would love to see more. Some African students, I'd love to see more in the post 9/11 and now post COVID world. It's it's harder.
Hold on one sec. Let me pause. You were talking about your students, more students from China. I think
more students East Asia, and I'd love to see more students from other places. Underrepresented places. Europe as well now is becoming underrepresented. Anyway, that is all to say, without getting on a tangent, when we talk about certain things in ethics and certain very culturally important things like, black and white in the racial sense, as we have it in the United States, is a very peculiar thing that has to do with North American history.
Mm-hmm.
Black and white have maybe similar meanings, but not the same meaning as they would in Brazil. They have similar, but not the same meanings that they would in Nigeria. They don't have the same meanings or even relevance in South Korea. And we have many South Korean students. And so as I'm teaching ethics, one thing that I'm really excited about is talking about these, like you were doing, talking about it in a more universal sense, using scripture, not just as a tool, but using, getting into scripture to understand things more correctly about how we divide humanity, how we mistreat each other, how we find all sorts of new ploys to privilege some and to disenfranchise others, and we do it. And so the black-white distinction in American history and the way that it's been used, going back to the slave trade, was one ploy in a whole history of human ploys. And that is not to dismiss it or to say that it doesn't have effects today,
not
or
at
to
all.
say that people are not deeply, that is not a deeply important question today. The American experience of, black and white is as I said, it's very peculiar on one hand, but it is somewhat well known around the world. I mean, after the killing of George Floyd, there were protests in Denmark, right? I mean, that tells you something about how America has exported its culture and even its problems.
Yeah.
So when I'm speaking with Korean students about some of these things, I want to keep in mind, well, how is this relevant to many East Asian students? How is this relevant to me? I'm neither black nor white. So often feel I'm politically unimportant. If you're white, you're politically important in America. If you're black, we know you're politically important. And if you're something else, what do we do with you? Some people feel that way. And so, I want to address those issues from a biblical perspective.
So you're saying the Bible has rich resources for ethics?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Those courses sound awesome. Which one do you enjoy teaching the most?
Right now, I've got 3 sections of Intro to Philosophy, and my head is really in there and just teaching the history.
What's your load? I should ask that. What's your teaching load?
Usually 4 courses, 3 hours each. That's a basic load.
Anything on the summer? What do you do in the summer?
It's on and off. If I have the time, I like to teach because I like to teach summer classes because they're intensives. We get everything done in 2 weeks. And I like to do it intensively because it helps me practice just telling one clear story from beginning to end. Whereas in a 16-week semester, you've got it broken up across the weeks, and then you have things like spring break and other things. It gets all hodgepodge broken. I like to just tell one clean story and just sort of revamp the way I'm doing it. So,
William Lane Craig, did you ever take one? You took William Lane Craig's J-term courses. I
took every course I could with him. Yeah.
So you must have had to use vacation time for that.
I did. There were sometimes I'd just take a 2-week vacation and never took my family. Uh, anything nice, I spend it, yeah, with Bill Craig. Mhm.
Your wife must be just tremendously a true believer.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
very supportive,
wow.
and
I
and
mean,
in
to try to explain that, like, you don't understand. It's William Lane Craig. The
right,
guy's a double PhD, one
right,
in German
right,
and another in British, and I don't even speak British.
right.
And yeah, so those were intense, right? Remember those? Like every day, and he
Yeah.
would just lecture
Hmm.
non-stop. And then
Yeah.
there was a big exam at the end. Blue
Yeah.
book. No, no. Was there a study guide? I can't remember. Was
No, no, no.
no study guide. What are you talking about with a study guide?
Yeah, no. We just have a small stack of books.
Very,
And
very European.
sometimes he would throw at us also a small stack of articles and a ton of reading for him. And then it all came to the end, and we would have
How many hours of lecture every day? It was 3 hours, right? Every day.
yeah, about there I might have had some that had more. I can't remember actually, but yeah, yeah, those were intense.
Well, everything is either indoors, outside, or intense.
That's a good point.
I said I did that little thing to in one of my classes, and this one kid, I think it was like I had a 13-year-old in my class one time in college. I think that the 13-year-old said, "What about the ocean? What about underwater? Was that outside?" I was like, "Oh man, I don't think I've ever thought about whether underwater is outside. I guess it is.
Yeah.
Under the ocean is outside, I guess."
Uh-huh. Yeah, I don't have an
Anyway,
ocean in my house, so yeah.
the person's going to be a good philosopher making these
Yeah.
distinctions.
Yeah.
So you got a 4.4 load. Um, how long have you been at Moody?
This will be my this fall will be my 10th year.
Oh, wow. It's been 10 years already.
Yeah.
It seems like last year you'd only been there 9 years. Seems like
Yeah. Right,
I'm trying to keep up here. Okay. All right. All right.
right.
I guess that makes sense. Now, are you enjoying Illinois? Do you like the seasons?
Um,
Spring's
yeah,
spring's coming up. It's going to be awesome.
yeah, it is awesome, and I do, as I said, Chicago is a great city. I don't know it as well as I'd like. I'm sort of in and out all the time, but
I want to go
um,
there just for the pizza some point.
mhm, yeah, yeah. Chicagoans are very serious about their pizza, so
Is it a
um,
clean city?
it's. I think so. I think so. I've seen New York's garbage problems and things like that, and I've seen the homeless issues in LA, and Chicago's nothing like that. South Side, people probably know the South Side of Chicago. You've heard of that. It's not a place I get to much, so I know it from the news as maybe a lot of people do, but it's really horrific with the gang violence and the things that are going on there. And it's a place where apparently life is considered pretty cheap. It's an unfortunate, persistent American urban problem. But the city that I go to, it is a beautiful city, right? Right on the lake, rivers, beautiful buildings, really interesting place. And I do, yeah, of course, I do enjoy that. I love Moody Bible Institute. Students are incredible, encouraging, um, thoughtful, energetic young people who want to do Christian ministry. And so I get along with them very well. I think and hope they like me too. So yeah, I like all of it.
You have an interesting name, Sanjay Merchant.
Yeah.
What's the story behind that name?
My father wanted me to have an Indian name, even though I wasn't being raised in India, and even though I'm not ethnically full Indian, but wanted,
Sanjay a common Indian name?
mhm, yeah, is
Like John, would it be John or Mark or something?
yeah, maybe something like that. Yeah, maybe the most famous would be Sanjay Gupta. The guy that's I think he's on CNN and he's a sort of medical authority. Um, so yeah, and then the name Merchant was a mix-up I believe, I think this is the right story. I've heard this from my father, that it was a mix-up where my great-grandfather didn't know on a census if he was being asked for his surname or his occupation. And so merchant came, of course, the English word for what his business was.
Yes. Oh, that's cool. It's a cool name. I like it. I think it rolls off the tongue well.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I've never
So-
much cared for it.
What?
I've never much cared for my name.
Really?
Yeah, that's very nice of you to say.
Well,
yeah,
it's just true. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I've always
Yeah.
liked your name. Ever since you told me what your name was, I was like, oh, that's a cool name.
Oh, okay. Well, that's really nice to hear. I think it's a little bit, I don't know, a little bit prissy. But,
So you mentioned it just a little while ago that in terms of race, did you have a race consciousness in Orange County growing up? Did you feel, well, I guess I just ask you, how did you feel?
yeah.
I don't want to give you the categories. Did you feel this or this?
No, as far as I know, I never really did. There were a few occasions where people expressed to me that they did see me as distinct in those ways. So where I grew up, South Orange County, largely white community, and I didn't see myself as white or non-white. As you're a kid, you don't really think about that so much. It's imposed on you a little bit. So if somebody were to ask me, are you white or non-white, I wouldn't have even known. So there's other what we would call minorities in this country, and the major minority in where I grew up would be like the East Asian, which would be considered as a white or non-white. America doesn't really know, but probably non-white. Anyway, I didn't have much of a race consciousness. It wasn't until people sort of put that on me, and there were a couple minor things like people would ask me things like, where were you born? And I would say, well, Indiana. As I mentioned to you, my father met my mother in Fort Wayne, Indiana when he was in grad school. And I had a teacher once say to me, no, it's not in 5th grade. She said to me, no, you weren't born in Indiana. You were born in India. Like I didn't know. And she was like, no, it's not Indiana. It's India. I was like, oh, okay.
Oh, well then, Miss So-and-so, tell me more about my my family. I
Right.
missed, where have you been in the family reunions?
Yeah. So there's a little bit of that where
Tell me about my grandfather.
yeah, where people are like, no, you're not from here. But it's
Your mom's not Italian. No.
right. I never considered it
German.
a significant thing at all. Or sometimes people, when I was a kid, they'd say, where are you from? That's what they would say. They'd say, where are you from? And I would say, I'm from here. I'm from here. It's like I'm Michigan. No. Where are you from? And then they would really emphasize the word from. I'd say, well, I was born in Indiana. They said, no. Where are you from? And I would be 10 years old, and I would think, are you so inarticulate that you don't know the word ethnicity? If you want to ask me that. But just saying from longer, I'm not going to play your game until you learn a better vocabulary. But I always felt like the insinuation was, of course you're tolerated, of course, but you're not really from here. You're not like us. That happened a little bit, but again, I don't care for getting on the bandwagon and making that the big issue in my life and acting like, oh, I was treated in these ways. For the vast majority of my life, it's had no significant impact on me at all, and I never think of it.
Praise God.
Yeah,
that's cool. That's so funny to hear that story. Yeah, it's also cool that you looked at it like an English issue. Like that's the funniest part about that story to me, is you're just like, the resources of the English language are there.
right.
And you should avail yourselves of them at some point. Grow. It's just wonderful. You can, it's amazing what you can accomplish with just a dictionary.
Yeah, and as philosophers, I mean, don't we encourage our students all the time? The development of your facility with language goes hand in hand with the development of your thinking. And
That's a
people,
huge point you just made. Yeah.
yeah, it's not about being snooty and using big words,
No,
which
no.
I hate being characterized that way. I hate, if I give a sermon at church, and I try not to do this, I've learned a lot about speaking and teaching in church, and bringing things down to a very understandable common level. It's not about showing off or speaking over people's heads, but sometimes if you want to get to deeper issues, you have to introduce a vocabulary
Yep.
that can carry those ideas. A
Mhm.
sort of basic, teenage level vocabulary just cannot carry deeper ideas. And you
No.
might struggle with them, but you just don't know how to handle them. You don't know what to do with them. So anyway, it's very important.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is there's an attention span issue. Do you run into the attention span issue with your students with social media and all that? Do they expect like an Instagram picture of the Trinity? I mean, how do you even do that?
There's definitely a little bit of it. I see the weariness in them sometimes. I see their eyes kind of glaze. Happily,
Mhm.
my classes are only 50 minutes long, and I fill up the whole class.
That's a shocker.
I try to make it conversational as best I can, but in some cases, just need to explain this for you, and they're very, very good. But sometimes I see the glossiness, and then all the students come to me and say, "I'm really trying," and I thought they were doing great. They asked a question, I thought it was a good question. They'll say, "I'm really trying to follow along, but I'm a little bit lost, and in all honesty, I'm not getting what you're saying about this. And can we talk more?" And so that happens, but there probably is something of an attention span issue. But they're pretty well trained. They can sit through a 50-minute class.
Do you feel pressure to inflate grades?
No,
Well, that's good.
no, we've never been given that sort of
You give
pressure.
everybody an A?
I'm a little
I was
bit
going to say there could be two possibilities. You already inflate grades with no
right.
pressure. I mean, it's all internal. I do it freely. Or you don't inflate grades, and the institution never thought about even the concept. So I just don't know the culture at
No,
Moody.
I have actually been very kindly. It wasn't warned. There's no warning, but a discussion with one time, and the discussion was, "Hey, do you want to think more about being discriminating in your grades? Your grades seem a bit high, just comparing to some other courses." And my first thought was, "Well, I'm doing a great job of teaching, and they're all getting it." So, but it was a good, helpful conversation. And I went, "Oh wow, now that you show me this, maybe I could be I could introduce a little bit more rigor here and here." And so
Yeah.
I
Of
tend
course,
towards
you can't give yourself credit if they work hard. That doesn't
yeah,
follow. I'm a good professor because they work so hard.
yeah. So I'm actually trying to, and my students hate to hear this, but I'll tell them I'm actually trying to find ways to introduce some more rigor, coming at it from different angles. And yeah, students are dealing with a lot right now. I've noticed a change now through COVID, and that I hope now we're considered sort of post-COVID era. I don't know, but I've noticed that issues of, at least they're telling me, issues of mental health, family emergencies, of just a sort of crisis of their social environments and their economic arrangements, and all of this is just so much more pronounced now. So I'm trying to be both understanding and helpful with those issues, but also finding a way to keep serious standards up, because there are some people, and it's hard. Sometimes it's hard, and I just don't have the time to figure out who's telling me the God's honest truth and who is milking it. It's hard to tell. I can't always tell. So I treat them all the same. If you come in and you tell me something and you say, "This is my situation," I take it as God's honest truth, and my only intention is to help you. But I don't want to enable those. And so I've tried to find some standards to say, okay, you're going through some serious issues. You've had to, go to the hospital a few times, but you want to finish the semester. I want to help you, but I can't just let everything go.
It's a tough position to be
So I'll
in.
try to hold some standards.
Yeah, that's a tough position to be in. I don't know what it's like to teach through this last couple of years. What was that like for you? Did you guys
Um,
did you shut down?
we did for one semester. Then
Was that
we
by order, by government order, or was that
what
voluntary? Okay.
no, it wasn't voluntary. Um, Moody definitely, is a Christian institution, and Christian institutions, they want, in general, I think they want to do everything in a cooperative, legal way, but aren't so beholden um, to certain legalistic perspectives on what we should and shouldn't do. I guess that would be a way of saying it. So some Christian institutions have pushed back a little bit, and more or less, I think, in reasonable ways. I think Moody, Chicago is a very blue place, and so was always talk about shutting us down again and things. And so Moody definitely tried to keep infection rates low, did the testing and all of that stuff, and we don't want to fight every fight, just continue on with providing education. So it was always kind of dicey because Chicago could shut us down, and Chicago is just its own kind of beast. So I hated teaching, honestly, through the mask. I hate not seeing the students' faces. It just really hinders, I think, the teaching and learning environment. And we're just coming through that. Just until a few days ago, actually, all my students were wearing masks because Chicago required it. It's finally lifted. So, and I don't know the reasons. I don't know why now, not before.
I can tell you the reason. The reason is because a few days ago you were in mortal danger. And then, you're just not in danger anymore all of a sudden.
I think it's something. It feels like that. It feels like that's the case.
And the bureaucrats know this. They're like, okay, on Tuesday, there's not going to be mortal danger.
Right.
But now.
Right. And I experienced this. I mean,
is there a vaccine mandate at the school?
There's a vaccine mandate through Chicago for schools. They just lifted this too, but there was for schools, for visiting restaurants, for any sort of indoor activities. You had to show a vaccine card.
Wow.
It was pretty strict. It was a vaccine mandate. Our school had a sizable minority, I'm thinking 30-40%, that got a religious exemption from it. So many people were happy to get their vaccination. There wasn't too much of it. I think it wasn't that polarizing at Moody. The people who wanted to do it did it. People who didn't want to didn't. And we just sort of left it at that. And people felt free to say they did or they didn't. And I don't think it was too judgmental. I might be wrong about that. But I think all in all, our community handled it pretty well. But yeah, there was a vaccine mandate. I don't know anything about, I honestly don't know anything about the science or anything. I didn't get vaccinated, and I'm happy to tell anybody that. Because
would you mind wearing a mask for the rest of the interview? Just, I did not know this, everybody. I did not know that he was not vaccinated before we started talking, and you've been without a mask. I love looking at your mugshot, but just for the remainder of this interview. Just kidding. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So you didn't get vaccinated.
I didn't. I don't have strong opinions about it either way. I don't. My wife does. She has very strong worries about the nature of the vaccination. She's told me many things. She's put a lot of mental energy into it. I don't know if she's right or wrong. I don't think she would mind me saying this, but she's not trained in medicine either. She's just sort of looking at this herself and has formed strong opinions. I don't necessarily go with those. I've stayed very neutral myself, but the way I see it, I'm healthy. I'm healthy, and COVID never seemed to me to be a death sentence. If it seems to you that it could be, if your immune system is compromised and you think it's the better bet for you to get the vaccine, then do it. But it seemed to me, and I never understood the vaccine as a sort of like an act of social responsibility. I could be dead wrong, and I'm happy to be dead wrong. I don't mean to make statements about things that I don't know anything about, but it's like you have to do your social duty. But me getting vaccinated doesn't make me less contagious. It doesn't keep me from getting the disease or passing it along. Maybe it reduces the time in which I have it, perhaps, and if it works well, it would reduce my symptoms or something like that. But it doesn't help anybody else. It's not like a social responsibility. purely a decision for me. And so I said, coronavirus probably isn't going to kill me. My wife thinks that the vaccine could have bad effects. I don't know. And so if there's a possibility, I don't know what's in the vaccine. Maybe it has bad effects. Maybe it's fine. Maybe I'm an idiot. Fine. But why get it? I'm not killing anybody or saving anybody by getting it. I'm just helping myself. I don't really think I need it. If I get sick with coronavirus, I will stay away from people and I won't endanger anybody. And if you want me to wear a mask in your establishment, fine. So that's kind of the way I saw it. I never understood why it was such the political issue that it was.
Now, did you, well, that all makes sense. I mean, you just sound like an educated person to me. Just everything you just said doesn't require any medical training at all.
Oh, okay. Is that your perspective?
Well, yeah, it's common sense what you just said. But what you just said is a political position. That's the Republican position. That's not the Democrat position. The Democrat position is this is a public health crisis. That means it's not a private decision. It's a public health decision. The tendency of the Democratic Party is to take the public and make it larger at the expense of the private. That's just generally what they do with economic regulations. Going back to segregation, by the way, this is pre-New Deal. Pre-New Deal. I mean, of course, FDR was a big part of this in the Great Depression, and that was very popular because people were afraid. They were tremendously afraid in the Great Depression. And so when there's a lot of fear like that, the government power, if you have certain leaders in there, it grows. Just like with World War II, there were tremendous fears about the Japanese invasion on the East Coast, or on the East Coast. Let me get my geography right. On the West Coast. So there was a Japanese exclusion. And that was just part of the war effort. I mean, get with it. What's wrong with you?
Yeah.
They attacked us. This is dangerous. And that's how it's justified. And Black people, we don't want them. That's crazy. So the economic regulation, there was forced segregation before the New Deal in Democrat areas. Well, anyway, I'm just pointing. I see things very clearly on. I'm not saying I'm right about everything, but I'm just saying it just seems to me that I see things that are right there. And I just point them out. I'm like, oh, it's right there.
Yeah,
but
that seems to make sense to me that that in American politics, the Democrats tend to emphasize public collective rights and prerogatives and to think about individuals as parts of collectives. They don't always deny individual rights, but they tend to emphasize one over the other. And let's say Republicans tend to emphasize individual rights and prerogatives over collective rights. Which one is more American? Which one is more in tune and in step with the American way of life and in step with justice in general? That's a difficult conversation.
Yeah.
And in this case, if coronavirus were an absolute death sentence, as people worried that it might be at the beginning, if it were an absolute death sentence, and me just carrying it could result in someone else's, it was an imminent threat to someone else's life, as it was often painted, and getting the vaccine would reduce that threat to others, then I would very much consider the collectivist ethics on that. I wouldn't just say, well, I have my individual rights and screw you, and I don't care if I give it to you. No, that wouldn't be right. But that case was never made. It was never made. We learned pretty early on. At first, we're like, oh no, this guy got coronavirus. The first couple of days, is he going to die? And then all these people are living through it just fine. And some people with very compromised positions, very old people and compromised, they were dying. Absolutely. Don't mean to make light of it. They were dying. But it turned out to be something that wasn't necessarily the public threat that they made it out to be initially. And I realized it's probably not going to kill me or anybody in my family. We're very blessed to be very healthy. I'm not too worried about it. So should I get the vaccine? Am I helping others? It turns out you're not really helping anybody else. You can still be contagious. You're only potentially reducing your own symptoms. And I thought, oh, okay. So if I really were saving other people's lives by getting the vaccination, and it really were the threat that they said it was, well, then I would consider that as my moral obligation. But that case was never made. And so I just balanced it. And I said, I could put this vaccine in me. Is it going to have a bad effect on me? And my wife said, I think it might. So I said, okay, never mind.
And that's traditionally why. And well, I was going to ask you, does this come up in your biblical ethics class, like the vaccine or anything like that?
I haven't taught that class yet. We're just going to start. But I've had conversations about the vaccine with students, and I've said some similar things to what we're saying now. And then some students feel very strongly that we need to be vaccinated, and we have that conversation. And so on something like this, if they tell me something that I'm unaware of, and they say, "No, Dr. Merchant, you're wrong about this," and they say X, Y, Z, I say, really good to hear. Really good to hear. Thank you for expressing that. And I just leave it at that and let it hang in the air. And then we continue talking and make our decision. Sometimes we just leave it and both sides say, we're not entirely sure. We need to go back and study this some more. And so I just let it be.
Yeah, I mean, it's a matter of authority. It's a matter of time. That's why traditionally people have had tremendous, except when presented with overwhelming evidence to the contrary, people have had, generally speaking, control over their private health, even when it affects other people. You see this with sexually transmitted diseases like AIDS. AIDS was a tremendously frightening thing in the 80s.
Yeah.
And there were a number of proponents of pretty harsh measures to deal with it, oftentimes coming from Republicans, unfortunately, like William Dannenmeyer in California. I'm not exactly sure is his position on things, so I don't want to attribute things, but he was the congressman for this area, actually, where I live. And then he retired and Ed Royce took over, and then Ed Royce just retired. But yeah, so it's tremendously interesting. What's interesting about this episode, Sanjay, is what makes this episode different, this kind of thing different than what we're doing, is it's very rare to get an expert, for example, on the Trinity, which you are, who teaches at a Bible college, faithful, evangelical, thoughtful, philosophically trained, astute, rigorous, and you have a nice, interesting, personal conversation with that person, talking about your background, talking about what it was like to go to school and stuff like that, not just the academics, but getting into the academics, getting into the weeds, and then just like some stuff politically and racially and gender stuff comes out of that, and it's all related, and people can kind of see, like, pick up things by osmosis and go, okay, well, there's a larger worldview here, and there's interesting options and connections. They're not logical entailments, but there might be connections that I'm missing. So yeah, so that's what I'm trying to capture here, is not just the nail hole, getting into there, take the nail out and just go in there like a worm into Trinitarian theology, and then you just stay there, and then that's the end of the episode, and you're just like, okay, I made it through that, but now what? I mean,
Right.
I mean, what connect some dots here, kind of thing. So yeah, so we did that a bit, and we've been going a while, so we'll let you go, but we've been so grateful to have you here. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Lucas. It's really good to connect after, like you said, it's been a while, and you were a guy in my time at Albit that was always really encouraging. You were, I don't know if people probably, if they only know you via this podcast, you're a funny guy, disarming guy. Always you always got a crowd around you, but always a really encouraging guy. You were pursuing your own studies. You have, I'm sure you told on your podcast, your own interesting academic background, and studied a variety of things, philosophy and theology and politics, and you got all of that stuff together, and know how to bring a variety of things together. And so you've got all of that stuff going on, but you were always encouraging me and others to do it in our own ways, And I remember that. I remember that very fondly. I remember when I got my first job at Grand Canyon, where you called me and you congratulated me and you told me that you said, you really deserve this. And I felt like, no, I don't. I'm very fortunate. I certainly don't. But it's really nice of you to say. It was too high of a compliment. But and I know that, you said, that I've worked hard. I know the amount of work you've put in developing courses and taught at probably every college in Southern California, right? And seen every kind of student and always had your hair on fire as well. And just what a slog it is to get through a PhD and all of that. And anyway, I've always appreciated your friendship.
Sanjay, that warms my heart to hear you say that. And I'm glad that that's your memory of me, because frankly, some of it's a blur looking back. And I wish I had clearer memories of Biola. I guess it was before iPhones, and I don't have hardly any pictures.
Yeah.
So, I taught at, for example, Pepperdine for over a decade. I've got tons of pictures, and I was always taking pictures, but of course after I got my iPhone.
Yeah.
The year, I guess I started there in 2007. So it was the year I got my iPhone. And I started taking pictures. I didn't, I had a camera with me, and I just wish that I hardly have any pictures of Denver Seminary. And I really wish that I had pictures with my professors and the classrooms and the kind of people that I was around. And so I try to document a lot. I'm very sentimental. So I document it. It's kind of like, I like creating archives. I like creating something that somebody else, maybe decades from now, 50 years from now, will stumble across this episode and is trying to piece together for their time what it was like in 2022. And will find this to be tremendously useful and maybe writing whatever version of a PhD is in 100 years. And I do believe that these digital records are the new library. And that's how I think. I think of when I read like an old book from like 1890 or something, and I wish you would have like tell me about what it's like to live there. Tell me about what it's like to get groceries. What's your day like? And I usually ask people what time they get up and what they had for breakfast. What time do you get up every day?
For school, I get up at 5, and in off days, I'll probably get up around 7. I sleep in a little bit.
And what do you typically have for breakfast?
I usually skip breakfast. I don't like to eat in the morning. So I'll eat a little bit later in the day. I've been doing that for a few years now. So I feel a lot more energy rather than ups and downs.
Praise God.
Yeah.
All right, buddy. Well, we're going to let you go. I'm going to stop recording.
Okay.
See you, buddy.